Thank you, Toya, and thank you, ambassadors, for being here. I think I would be underestimating together. I've got about 100 years of diplomatic experience on the stage, without counting me, of course. So we hope to learn from their experience in this world, which is forever changing, the role of India, which is expanding, and of course a world which is being increasingly described as a divided world. But I want to begin by asking all of you, and I'll start with Ambassador Shankar, how does Bharatiya Foreign Service sound? Better than the Indian Foreign Service?
Well, we are just used to Indian Foreign Service, but we don't have objection to Bharatiya either. It means the same.
It means the same. Sir, would you like to add to it? There's a lot of speculation about India being, how should I put it, I don't know, rebranded as Bharat again or solely as Bharat?
Look, I can tell you straight away that over the years, over the decades, the complexion and character of the Indian Foreign Service has changed.
Yes.
It's far more representative today, just as our cricket teams are far more representative today. It's not just the Maharajas and the, rich people who play cricket today. So I'm quite for Bharatiya Foreign Service or Bharat Foreign Service. Sounds good to me.
Yes.
Well, India, that is Bharat, has been around. Let's have Bharat without anyway giving up on India, because India is a huge brand equity. This is something which is recognized the world over. So let's not dilute it while we bring up, highlight our identity as Bharat.
Absolutely. Ambassador Kanta, why don't I begin with you also by understanding from you, how do you think India has made the G20 presidency different? Because, we were speaking to Amitabh Kant earlier, for example, on our event, and the government believes that they've made it a people's presidency versus what most countries deal with it as. Do you agree with that? And how do you think India has managed to put its own stamp on what is the prestigious stage of a G20 presidency?
No, I think there's many different ways, India's presidency will be seen to be different. One obviously is that we have taken not only G20 but the various engagement groups of G20 to different parts of the country. I believe events have been organized in as many as 60 cities and towns, which is for the first time.
Yes.
G20 presidency is trying. We are setting the bar rather high. This might become the new template future presidencies. Second point I would like to highlight is that we started our presidency by, raising the voice of Global South. Prime Minister hosting a virtual summit in January, which is very timely, very appropriate, at a moment when developing countries belonging to so-called Global South are hurting. Their concerns, aspirations, interests need to be projected. And I believe our presidency of G20 is trying to do that.
Yeah. Ambassador Chinnoy, you want to add to something that, on that, how India has done the G20 presidency differently, because you've been involved with the think tanks as well?
Yeah, sure. So I speak as the Think 20 chair for India's G20 presidency. And let me tell you that the Think 20 is one of the most important engagement groups. It is in fact the ideas bank of the G20, and it's one of the biggest. And we've had about 64 events, not only around India, but also a few overseas. We have produced 400 policy papers. We had a Dropbox on our website to allow millions of others to participate by giving ideas, etc. So I can tell you that the outreach that we've had so far over the past 10 months or so has been phenomenal. We, in fact, for our summit in Mysore, as for every other meeting, including the mid-year meeting in Mumbai, we have had about 135 scholars participating, representing virtually every major think tank and academic institution in India, but also across the world. There is an international advisory board that I chair, and there too, apart from maybe 3 Indians, the rest are all from different parts of the world. And I think we have actually ensured gender equality. We've ensured that Africa is represented, Latin America is represented. Even the major powers are all represented. So I think we've done a phenomenal job. And that, when you take it to the government track of the G20, only gets magnified.
Okay.
You've seen how much more they've done.
So, in other words, India has truly managed to put its own stamp as far as this presidency is concerned. Ambassador Shankar, I want to begin by asking you, because we are, we are working in an environment which is being called very divided. A divided world and a G20 presidency. So I want to begin by asking you first about the entire fallout of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Do you think India has convincingly managed to turn around the view of America and its allies, NATO countries, etc., on what was India's stand on the conflict, and what do you think helped India in doing so, if so?
Well, let me say first that when the G20 was set up, at summit level, which was after the financial crisis, the world was more benign. The relationship between the great powers was not so antagonistic, erupting into direct conflict and a proxy war, as we see in Russia and Ukraine today. You also see that the competition between the US and the Western world on the one hand and China on the other is also intensifying, both at the economic, military and technological level. So you're in a world which is far more fractured, which makes it more difficult to reach consensus in the G20. Now, initially, I think the Western world, and especially the US, had the expectation that India would have a position on Ukraine which would be close to theirs.
Yes.
But we have our own perspective on these issues, and we have a long-standing relationship with Russia. We understand that the Ukraine war is not a one-off, that there is an international historical context, and that Russia sees it as an existential struggle for itself. Ukraine too sees it as an existential struggle for itself. So it's a more complex situation than black or white. And we have strategic equities in Russia, and we have been able to explain to the US that our stand is not an anti-Western stand, but a stand which looks to protect India's strategic interests at a time when we have a live border.
Yeah.
You know, 60% of our defense equipment is of Russian origin. There is no way that India would be able to ignore this fact.
So overall, you think this is an example of the heft of India's diplomacy today, that they've managed to do it despite the pretty strong criticism that was coming India's way and the pressure that was mounting on the entire stand over Russia?
Yes, I think it's also, I think the US for once is showing strategic patience.
Okay.
They are not showing impatience, saying, you know, demonstrate to us that you are with us in the next 5 minutes or else, which in the past sometimes has been their tendency. So they are willing to show strategic patience.
And that changes by?
And I think that there is an increasing convergence of strategic interests in Asia in establishing a more stable Asian balance of power, not under the domination of any one country, and this drives the relationship, enabling them to handle their differences better. Now, we are a developing country. The US is a developed country. Our perspective on many global issues will not necessarily be the same as that of the US. And I think now they understand that, and as long as we are able to navigate our differences in a mature way, without letting them, you know, grow into disputes, and as long as we keep our eye on the main ball, I think the relationship is robust.
Okay. Ambassador Chinoy, I want to come back to you. Do you think India can manage to reduce the shadow of the Russia-Ukraine conflict on this G20 summit, if not completely eliminate it? Or are we very much going to have it under the specter of what is going on?
Look, I think it's best for India to continue with the line that it's taken so far, which is one of neutrality, which is one of strategic autonomy. And so it's really, in my view, not for India to try and, dictate the contours of the agenda, because the G20, unlike the UN Security Council, does not have that privileged exceptionalism. There's no veto power. And in a group such as this, we work on the basis of consensus or near consensus. And therefore, I think on the one hand, everyone has a right to present the picture as they see it. And we do recognize that there are many countries that see some kind of a linkage between the war in Ukraine and the economic situation and developmental issues and the trouble with food, fertilizer, finance and things like that. So I think we must give them that chance to express themselves. Having said that, I think it's our job to also tell them that the G20 is not the UN Security Council.
Yes.
It's also not the G7. And it's actually a much more representative grouping. And if I were to describe it, I would say in this era of fractured multilateralism, weakened multilateralism, a dysfunctional UN, a dysfunctional WTO, if you were to think of a dream team at the multilateral level, it is the G20. And it's going to become even more of a dream team when we bring in the AU.
Yeah.
And so make the most of that.
And don't hold it hostage to any one particular
Absolutely.
concern.
And the important thing is that India has succeeded throughout the year in bringing core developmental issues to front and center. And that is a huge achievement. So from my point of view, regardless of what comes out or does not come out in the form of a communique, the G20 presidency has always been hugely successful.
All right.
It's done its job.
Well, that's a big vote of thanks, vote of confidence coming from you. Ambassador Kanta, I want to understand from you, the Russian president, the Chinese president are not coming. Particularly, how do you see the message with Xi Jinping giving it its kip? Is there a message, and what is that message for India?
Well, Xi Jinping, as you know, he had attended previous G20 summits, except one when he couldn't travel because of pandemic. It was an expectation that he will come to India. He's not coming to India, sending his premier, Li Qiang, is a departure from past practice. I would like to believe that China remains strongly committed to G20 agenda. At the same time, the fact that Xi Jinping will not be participating in G20 summit reflects two things. One, state of relations between India and China at this point of time.
Yes.
The fact that relations continue to be in a downward spiral. And there's not much optimism at this point of time that things will start improving.
Anytime soon.
That's one. Second, I think it's also a signal to G20 as a grouping that China is not attaching as much
importance
to the grouping as it did in the past.
And why is that, you think? Why are they sending this message,
well,
especially this year?
Perhaps Xi Jinping feels more comfortable in settings like SU and BRICS, where China
carries more
pretend to be the leading player. Here, if you look at various outcome documents which have come out, there is a consensus among 7 countries and EU.